Welcome. Today we're going to discuss the technique Darting Mace and how to relate it to other elements of the American Kenpo system. Now keep in mind that this is not a full comprehensive list, far from it, and it's not family groupings. So rather, it's just different ways of exploring and understanding how the American Kenpo system was structured. So let's start out this relationship through a concept that's highlighted in Darting Mace, and that would be the standard extension. So if you take a look at Darting Mace, we start out with the darting piece, and then what do? We do this standard extension. But the interesting thing to notice is how we're applying it. We're using the standard extension to control our opponent's depth. So can we do the standard extension controlling different dimensions? Well, absolutely. If you take a look at something like thrust and prongs, that's exactly what we're doing. We're now controlling their height zone so that we can do that standard extension. So if we can do the depth and the height, can we do the width? Well, this we're bringing something like thrusting salute. Or if you notice, what we're doing now is controlling the width before executing that standard extension. So let's move on to different ways of doing the standard extension. Something like gift of destruction. If you notice, we're going to be using dead mass motion to start doing the standard extension. So what do I mean by that? Well, the fact that his mass is dead or not moving, we can take advantage of it to pull us so that we can do the standard extension. But notice that rather than engaging, we're actually controlling the arm so that we can do the standard extension. But let's move this into an in-flight minor rather than an applied minor. In this case, something like parting wings, where if you notice, we're doing our technique and then finishing it up with the standard extension. But just like we can do minors, can we do majors? Well, this would bring in something like clipping the storm, where we're now actually dealing with a weapon. And in this case, because we're dealing with a weapon, we have to take that into consideration and do something slightly different. Deal with the weapon. This is why we're clipping the storm before doing that standard extension. But up to this point, it's very easy to see how these standard extensions are similar. So let's do a couple of things. Number one, change the fact that we've been using it to control or gauge their dimensions and actually execute it using different dimensions. But also, let's do it from a point where it no longer looks like the standard extension, but we are in fact still executing the standard extension. And this would bring in something like circling fans, where if you notice, what we're doing here is the standard extension, but now primarily using height. And if we move this into something like fatal deviation, we would now be doing it, but in this case, primarily using width. So if we take this even further into something like entwined maces, we would now be doing it, controlling it using depth. But the interesting thing to notice is, like unlike all our previous techniques, we're now using the backs of the weapons rather than the front of the weapons. But this is going to lead us into one final thought, and that's the name itself, standard extension. If you notice, in Darting Mace, the standard extension is part of the ideal phase. But in something like gift of destruction, it's actually pretty much the entire technique. But that leads in the final one, parting wings. If you notice, we actually use the standard extension to extend the ideal phase of the technique. So why is it important to highlight that? Well, because of the formulation equation. If you notice, the formulation equation has a prefix, an insert, and a suffix. And that typically deals with singular maneuvers. But a standard extension is basically a set of maneuvers that can also be used with the formulation equation. So another way to think about it, just like foot maneuvers, standard extensions are added as needed. So how do we relate Darting Mace to other techniques of the American Kenpo system? Was through the concept of standard extension. We hope this video helps you understand the American Kenpo system a little bit better. Thank you very much.